And here we are, day 5 of the 20-day flower creation journey. Today we are going to paint the stalk. The stalk is used as a filling flower, and I'm going to use this picture from the Flower Color Guidebook to start to represent it. Flowers are of round shape and the petals are very, very light. I'm going to use my beloved filbert brush. This is the Princeton Select filbert brush in size 8 because the shape of the brush is round and flat, and it is perfect, I think, to create these petals. I create a mixture of yellow ochre and magenta to start create the first flower. I touch and press the paper with my filbert brush and I drag these petals towards the center. I use the belly of my brush and the side of my brush to drag all of my petals from the outer part of the flower towards the center. I create a different mixture of magenta and yellow ochre, and I create different flowers, very light in color, so I use a very little concentration of pigment and a higher concentration of water to create these petals, and I drag all of them towards the same center. Keeping in mind how this stalk looks like on the picture, I start from the bottom part of the paper and I create a big amount of flowers, so a sort of cluster of flowers at the bottom of the page. I use the side of the brush and I create some strokes from the outer part to the inner part of the flower to create a little bit of more definition. And I keep adding flowers going to the upper part of the paper. I keep mixing a little bit of yellow ochre and a little bit of magenta in different amounts, and in this way I will achieve different colors and I will have overall a composition that is not boring and very interesting to look at. I notice that the clusters of flowers are sometimes pretty far from each other, and in the middle there is going to be the thick stem. Therefore, I keep this in mind and I create these flowers, leaving a little bit of space to create in a second moment the thick stem. In this moment, all the petals and these flowers are very light. They are not very saturated. It means that the amount of pigment in all of these brush strokes is not very concentrated, is not very high. I want to create this composition in this way in first place because I notice that the picture has these flowers and the flowers are very, very light. I keep adding flowers and petals going up towards the upper part of the page, and I keep using the belly of my brush and the side of my brush to create strokes of different size and different colors by mixing more or less magenta, more or less yellow ochre. The more I reach the top, the more I create flowers that are just a quick stroke on the paper and they are less defined, because I see from my reference picture that on top these flowers have just little buds. I decided to create these buds on top with a more concentrated color. This is a bit different from what I see on the picture, but this is what I felt like doing in the moment I was painting, and therefore I allowed myself to just deviate a little bit from the reference picture and just create something that I like to paint. At this point though, I realized that I actually prefer these flowers to be a little bit more concentrated in color. In particular, having bright colors popping from the white paper is something that is very characteristic of my type of art. Therefore, I've decided to go back and to add a little bit of more concentrated strokes onto the flowers that I have already created. You can decide to do the same, or you can decide to keep all of these petals and flowers very watery, so it means that there is a very little amount of pigment and a higher concentration of water onto these brush strokes. Remember, this is the art that needs to please your eyes and needs to please your imagination, so you are the artist and you are totally allowed to create the thing that you like the most. At this point, I take my mop brush and I start to create the stem in the center of these flowers. I just use the tip of my brush and I start to create the stem in the center part with a little bit of subgreen. Using just the tip of this mop brush will allow me to create a very thin line while I assess the whole composition and I understand where to add leaves and other parts of the composition. To create the leaves, I use this mop brush. I add pressure and release the pressure. With the point of this brush, I just give more definition to these leaves, but I press and release the pressure. Basically, with the belly of this brush, I am allowed to create these leaves that are thick and elongated because I keep the pressure for longer. The longer you want the leaf, the longer you will need to keep the pressure of your brush onto the paper. I follow the reference picture to add a few leaves onto this composition, and then I keep adding, always in very loose style, these little buds on top of the stock flower. On the left side, I just follow the reference picture and add a few strokes. I rinse off the mop brush and I take instead a round brush in size 6 and using a little bit of yellow and yellow ochre, yellow lemon dip and yellow ochre, I start to add the center of these flowers. I touch with the tip of this brush the center part of the flower and I add a few dots that represent the center part of these stock flowers. At this point, I rinse this round brush and instead I take my mop brush. I take it back because I wanted to add some darker details and I mix a little bit of green, sub-green with a little bit of phthalo turquoise in order to create a darker green. And with this mixture, I'm gonna add some strokes onto the leaves that are still wet. Through the wet and wet technique, this darker green is going to blend with the green that we have created in first place, and it will create some beautiful effects, especially when the whole composition is going to be dry. As you know, I always like to add these strokes toward the end of the composition when I have an overall understanding of what I've created and I see where I want some areas to pop. In this case, after adding the details to the leaves, I do the same with the flowers and using the tip of the mop brush, I mix a little bit of magenta and yellow ochre and not adding so much pressure, but just a very little pressure, I created these fine lines in the center part of these flowers. If you like the composition without these fine lines, you're totally fine to stop at this point and enjoy what you have created. I personally like to add these lines because I think they give a little bit of more texture to the whole composition and to the flowers. I mix a little bit of yellow ochre and magenta. Sometimes I use just a little bit of yellow ochre. The color of these lines don't have to be always the same. You can look at your reference picture to understand where to add these lines, or you can just follow your imagination and just add them where you think it looks the best. I add some final details to this composition in darker color. This is pure magenta. I take my filbert brush and I just add a few buds because I've created some stems that at the moment don't have these colored brush strokes. So that's what I'm doing at this moment. I am just refining the composition, I'm looking overall at what I've created, and I'm adding a few components where I think they are missing. At this point, for example, with my mop brush, I just keep adding a little bit of lines and fine strokes to the center to define better the stem. I add a few buds by touching the paper with the point of my brush. And I do the same on the top. At this point, I'm pretty happy with how this composition looks like. So this tutorial is completed. I really hope you enjoyed and you learned something from it. See you on day 6.